You are listening to an MLGA Network podcast.
Hi, this is Jessie with the Voluntary Vixens. I am doing a solo episode today, but I do have a guest, and his tag name on Instagram is called Too Savage for Status, and he was in Hong Kong during the protest, so I thought it would be a good idea to just interview him and get an idea of what it was like on the ground during the protest, especially during the Polytechnic siege. He was there for the very beginnings of it. So without further ado, let's just get this interview started.
Welcome to Voluntary Vixens, where Jessie and Maddie give a female voice to news and pop culture with a libertarian twist. Join us to stay informed and challenged while keeping it sane, peaceful, and most importantly, voluntary.
So today I have John here with me. John, you were a medic, is that correct? In Hong Kong. Can you kind of give us an idea of just some of the things that you were over there, why you were over there in the first place, and some of the things that you were doing while you were over there?
So my main job while I was in Hong Kong was to be a first aid. I was first aid to the frontline protesters there in Hong Kong. I also helped out the civilians whenever they got hit in the crossfire, which happened quite often. But my main job was essentially to treat all of the protesters that were injured in the protest movement. Mm-hmm. And I was just there to, and I also was doing documentation, press work while I was there.
Okay. All right. So you were mostly there, I guess, for then the protesters' first line. Okay. And was this like through your school or through a church, or was this just some friends of yours that got together and decided to do this?
No, so I did this myself. So this is something that while I was studying, I decided I should be part of this. So I decided to go in and do it. Basically just got my funds together and planned this all out.
Okay.
Went to Hong Kong to help the freedom fighters.
Okay. So what was it in your personal opinion that made you want to help these people out?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of protests going on right now all over the world, but I saw this one in Hong Kong as unique because specifically these people are fighting for freedom. They've seen what it's like to be free. They are one of the freest nations on earth. Hong Kong is. Mm-hmm. And so they know what it's like, and they're seeing these rights that they have enjoyed for so long being stripped away. Being part of the fight to keep people's rights is something that I want to be a part of.
Right. Is there something, I guess, because like you're saying, there's protests going on everywhere. Lebanon, Santiago, Chile, Iran. There's something about Hong Kong that really just drew you because of they were pretty much like one of the freest countries in that region, probably in the world. I would say they're probably freer than we are, economically speaking, or they were.
Yeah, definitely freer than we are.
One of the things that I found interesting about them is that, and I contacted you about this because I have a friend that lives in Hong Kong. He's been a business owner over there, and he's older. He's got kids, and he's a family guy. So I don't know if that has something to do with it, but he has been posting stuff on Facebook and Instagram just about being against the protesters and kind of taking the side of the Chinese police. So that's why I started getting interested in this whole situation because of him, because I was amazed that he was taking the side of the Chinese police. What are your thoughts on people that, like expatriates that live there, and how they are viewing this whole thing?
So you're saying he's an expat?
Yeah, he's an American that's living over there. He has a business that he started over there. Him and his wife are both expatriates. And I think the post I sent you to kind of get your thoughts on it, he was talking about students throwing bricks at Hong Kong citizens, and how, I guess he was just saying that, the police should be here because they're out of control. And then I saw a lot of posts or a lot of comments after that were saying stuff that these students are just seeking attention. They're just wild. They're not helping anything. And you seem to have a lot of thoughts about the expatriates, or how Hong Kong citizens view expatriates during this time, or maybe just in general.
I mean, yeah, I mean the people in Hong Kong see the expatriates as naive, and basically they call it the expat bubble because they
Mm-hmm.
see the expatriates as in a bubble, like not with the reality of the people in Hong Kong.
Right.
But I mean, I don't want to offend him personally, but I've noticed a lot of the expats are against it, but most of the Hong Kong civilians are very for the protest. Like, even if you see just barely, a lot of the Chinese state media was saying the Chinese, or the silent majority is against the protesters. Well, I mean, they just had local elections, and all of the candidates that were behind the protesters, that were for the protesters, won, and all of the candidates that were against the protest lost. So I think that shows which side the silent majority is on.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, that's one of the things is that kind of just blew my mind, I think, is I know this guy personally, and he's normally pretty pro freedom, and that seemed a little bit out of character for him. So I don't know if he was maybe because he lives over there and he relies on his business over there, that maybe he was saying this kind of stuff to kind of seem like he was playing, playing ball, or maybe he really is just naive. I don't know. I think that a lot of people that I'll just say my husband is half Chinese. He's always wanted to go back to China and live there and raise our kids in that culture. And ever since, China itself has just been kind of becoming more and more closed down. They have this social currency system going on now with facial recognition cameras, and I'm just not I'm not really I just don't like the idea of that. But I was thinking maybe Hong Kong would be a good idea because they speak Cantonese. That's where his dad is from, or that's the language he speaks. I was thinking we could at least do that maybe. Now all this stuff is happening. So I don't know if that will happen anytime soon. So I guess it's a little personal for me.
Overall, outside of the protest areas, Hong Kong is extremely safe, even though no one uses the police anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, no one, like, the police are seen by the Hong Kong people as the enemy, so like no one will use the police to report any crimes or anything. Even though they don't rely on the police anymore, it's still extremely safe in Hong Kong. As long as you stay out of the protest areas, you're fine.
Right. I guess so. Let's kind of back up a little bit and can you kind of let the listeners know a little bit about like what started this whole thing? What started all the protests?
I mean, there was definitely the Extradition Act that was like the match that lit the flame, but like to understand why the Hong Kongers, like, you have to understand the whole history behind everything, really. So
Mm-hmm.
Hong Kong used to be a British colony. This is like way back when the 1800s, Britain went to war with China, and Britain won, and they made a peace agreement saying that Britain can have this little fishing village that nobody in China cared about called Hong Kong. And that was the agreement. For 99 years, Britain would have Hong Kong. But because essentially Britain left Hong Kong alone and they had free markets and all that, especially towards the end of the British rule of Hong Kong, they went from this little fishing village to the financial center, one of the biggest financial centers in the world.
Right.
And so 99 years was up, and so by contract, Britain was forced to give Hong Kong back to China.
Mm-hmm.
So from there, the Britain and China made an agreement saying that they would be together, that Hong Kong would be basically independent of China. They would be they'd have their own government separate from China for 50 years. And China originally agreed to it. And people were happy with this because the people of Hong Kong were happy with this because they got their own independent government, all that. Until 2003 hit.
Mm-hmm.
Article 23 was tried to pass through legislative, and Article 23 was essentially said that if you criticize the Chinese government, you can be imprisoned, just like how it is in China.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't pass. But I think that was really a bombshell for the people in Hong Kong. They realized like what the realities of what's going to be like living under this tyrannical rule under the CCP. So that's when resentment really just started boiling from there, because now like people see the CCP, which is the Chinese Communist Party, as this dictatorship essentially that they don't care about human rights.
Right.
And so that just resentment just kind of boiled up and boiled up. And in 2014, the umbrella movement happened. It was a series of peaceful protests that ended after the leaders were arrested, like Joshua Wong, all of that. That was a little, and then up until 2019, Carrie Lam and the legislative tried to pass an extradition act, which said that basically China could extradite people from Hong Kong into China and put them through China's legal system. But the people don't trust China in Hong Kong at all. Like they understand the horror stories of the Chinese legal system.
Right.
And so they wanted no part of that. And so protests just started popping up. One of the first major protests, 1 million people showed up. Next protest, 2 million people showed up. And that's like 25% of the Hong Kong population, which is the largest by proportion in human history. Third protest, 1.7 million people showed up. Just these crazy numbers. And it just kind of went from there.
I think it's amazing, really. In America, like, we have the Pussy Hat protests and stupid little marches like that over rights that we already have, and no one's willing to die for anything, and you know what I mean? Like, all our protests in America, no one's willing to die for those causes, let's just face it. But these kids are putting themselves, they're putting themselves in major harm's way. And I've actually listened to some of their some other interviews that on some other I think it was another documentarian. He was interviewing them, and they were saying things like, we're willing to die. We don't want to live under China's rule, and we will die before that happens. That just really, and it's it's just crazy. And these are like college kids.
Yeah.
They haven't even begun to live, and they're already, ready to die for freedom. And here in this country, I feel like we're ready to, we have a whole subset of people that are willing to just give all the rights away to government.
Yeah.
So.
Definitely a completely different world here in America and in Hong Kong.
Oh yeah. I'm pretty inspired by them. So whenever I hear somebody saying what they're doing is stupid and not the right thing, it just, it blows my mind how Americans can see what they're doing and not think that that's brave.
Yeah. The Chinese media has definitely done a lot to stir the pot. I don't know if you heard about the 50 Cent Army. And China has an army of internet trolls that go around commenting under any single post that has anything to do with Hong Kong related, basically saying the rioters are terrorists, yada, 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 all that. And they get 50 cents every time they post a comment or anything like that.
Oh, I didn't know that. Now, I heard you in another interview talking about the cops doing things like, dressing as protesters and hiding in ambulances and other things like that. Is there anything? Are there other things I just kind of missed in that that they've been just dirty tricks that they've been pulling?
The police are definitely very brutal. Mm-hmm. From what I've seen, they really are brutal.
Now, tell me a little bit about some of their tactics. Like, we've talked about them hiding as protesters and hiding in ambulances, but there's reports that are using like live ammunition on these protesters.
It rarely ever happens. I'm not sure if it's restraint or they're afraid of bad PR, but they rarely ever resort to live ammunition. Most of the times they resort to tear gas, which they've started using tear gas canisters as live bullets.
Oh.
You're supposed to shoot tear gas canisters by the crowd, not in the crowd. Mm-hmm. But they'll shoot the canister. They'll basically aim directly at the protesters, and it will hit them. And the tear gas canisters melt through cement. So.
Ooh. So so when you were doing some of you're dealing with burns.
Yeah, major burns.
Oh my God. Now, I also was hearing that some of these people that were providing medic care to these protesters were being arrested or prevented from providing care too.
I mean, it's illegal to be a medic at these protests.
Oh, okay.
I mean, if they decide to arrest you, you'll get the same punishment as the protesters.
Even you would? Like they would take you away? Oh
Yes.
my gosh. So what is the sentence for protesting?
10 years in prison.
And there's no like wiggle room. You know how we say it's up to 10 years, but
I mean, I guess it is up to 10, but
okay.
I mean, I would say most of the people that did get charged got all 10 years that I've heard.
Oh no. Okay. So it doesn't matter if you're a Chinese or a Hong Kong citizen or a foreigner, you are going to get arrested and treated the same.
Yeah, you're gonna get treated the same.
Oh gosh, that is ridiculous. See, I'm a nurse, so I can't even imagine not being like somebody trying to keep me from taking care of a patient. Like that just baffles my mind.
Yeah, the police will do everything to stop the medics from treating the people they injure.
That's ridiculous. So wait, so even if like the ambulances come and pick them up, the ambulance driver could get in trouble.
No, not the ambulance driver. Paramedics are fine.
Okay. So just anybody who's like behind the lines that's trying to just provide first aid type of stuff. Okay. Another thing that you mentioned in another interview was the 5 demands.
Yeah, the 5 demands. Usually that is their main like rallying cry. That is what they want. They say when you go to these protests, you'll hear them scream 5 demands, not one less. 5 demands, not one less. But they'll usually be yelling that in Cantonese.
Mm-hmm.
The 5 demands is 1, withdraw the Extradition Act, which did happen. The second is do an inquiry into police brutality, which has not happened. The third demand is reclassify the peaceful protests. I mean, there was peaceful protests that were classified as riots. Classify them back as protests. Release the protesters from prison.
Mm-hmm.
And the 5th demand is universal suffrage, which is like the main demand really now.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are the 5 demands, and they won't stop until all 5 demands are met.
Okay, so in Hong Kong, they don't have universal suffrage? Like, I guess I don't understand.
In Hong Kong, the Chinese government chooses with their president, the chief executive, and they choose almost everyone in their Congress, their legislative.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the Hong Kong government is a puppet of the Chinese government.
Are they having elections soon, or have they already had elections?
They just had local elections, and we were talking about the silent majority earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And we were saying how the silent majority are backing the protesters as they showed on the polls. Yeah, local elections. So they're able to choose their local leaders, which is Hong Kong is separated into like districts, like just how the New York is separated to Manchester, the Bronx, whatever, all that.
Mm-hmm.
Hong Kong is separated into 18 different districts, and there's different political leaders for each district. And so they were voting for those elected officials.
So I guess they've got one of their demands met right now. So they're just waiting on the 4. Do you think that there's a good chance that they're going to get all those demands met?
I mean, I honestly don't know what's going to happen. I mean, if they don't, this is going to majorly hurt the Chinese economy, but because all foreign investment into China goes through Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically this is the way China gets their money. And so if Hong Kong falls, so does China, because they lost their source of funding. So Hong Kong really has that to hold China against their will. But I don't know if China will back down like that.
Right.
I have no idea. Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, what are some of the things that the protesters, besides the 5 demands, what are some of the things that the protesters have said, at least to you, that they would like America or the Westerners to do to help them?
I mean, they definitely wanted the Human Rights and Democracy Act passed, which just came through the House and the Senate, which is why you see them wave that's one of the reasons why you see them wave the American flag at these protests.
Mm-hmm.
Human Rights and Democracy Act basically it does a few things. It says basically the State Department will monitor whether Hong Kong is what is independent enough from China as made by the Chinese agreement with Hong Kong. And if it's not, America will place sanctions against the Chinese. And they also banned all America was providing riot gear to the riot police in Hong Kong, and the bill basically banned that.
Okay, good. We don't need to give the cops any more. They have already.
Yeah.
So, and then just like, one of the things I was just, curious about, because I was talking about this with some people today, because it does seem like they are signaling a lot to America when you're looking at a lot of the pictures coming out. A lot of the signs are in English, and some of the chants are in English. I just see a lot of, it seems like they're really trying to reach out to America in a lot of different ways. The average American, I'm just wondering, like, what do we do? Do we just keep trying to put out the truth, like what's really going on over there?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Keep putting out the truth. Keep saying what's happening in the news about Hong Kong. The Human Rights and Democracy Act. Hopefully, Trump signs the bill.
Mm-hmm.
That's the next person needs to go. It needs to go through, and like you can also donate to the Spark Alliance or
Okay.
just the different charities that are going to Hong Kong. They're really just trying to get the world behind Hong Kong, which will like deter China from doing anything to Hong Kong. They want as many countries behind the protesters as possible because they want that as a deterrent from China doing anything to the Hong Kong protesters, basically using other countries as a shield.
Yeah. Well, I think that a lot of the world really depends on Hong Kong's success, really, monetarily wise. China is not the only one that relies on them to do well. But it would be nice if Donald Trump would that would be kind of a big deal to let refugees from Hong Kong come here to get away if things get really bad. I think it would actually help him a lot because he's comes off as though he hates immigrants and refugees. And what better way to, prove people wrong than by letting these people come and get, safe. What are some other things that they want to get out, like, to the rest of the world, these protesters?
What do they want the rest of the world to know?
Yeah. I think that honestly, I think that a lot of our like media here in America, we just don't really know it's really what the protests are about. And I don't think that we really understand how bad the Chinese government has gotten unless you really look into it.
I was gonna say the main thing that protesters want people to know is like if China like is willing to take down Hong Kong, they're willing to go against Taiwan next and the South China Sea and
Mm-hmm.
further and further around the graphs and then Africa and then Australia. Basically just saying like if you let China do this, China will try to take over the world.
Okay. They really think that I don't think that people think that that's a possibility. Like, they don't think that they really want that.
Maybe not the Chinese people, but the Chinese government is
Mm-hmm.
doing what they can. Very, very slowly, they're buying up all of the countries in Africa
Yeah.
and Latin America.
I knew about Africa.
Trying to take over the government in Australia.
Really?
Push, yeah, push, like they've had Chinese agents that they've tried to get into the top levels of Australian power.
Crazy. I did not know that.
And like, I would say they want the South China Sea. They want that because if they have Taiwan and South China Sea, so much goes through that sea that it would really establish the power of Hong Kong. I'm sorry, of China, not Hong Kong. Establish the power of China.
Right. Now, you were in the beginning parts of like the Poly-U whole siege that was going on there. Can you kind of give us an idea of just how it just led to that whole thing? I know that there were protests going on all throughout the summer, basically, but how did it end up being where these kids were just stuck inside this university and couldn't get out?
I don't know exactly why they chose the universities. I know that police were getting search warrants to search through protesters' dorms to like have proof that they were at the protest,
Mm-hmm.
and like a lot of the protesters lived there, so that's like a convenient spot to start fortifying and taking territory, just like basically where they live. And so protesters basically just fortified it completely. I don't know if you saw on my Instagram stories, I was touring the different defenses they had, and like they just like had it layers upon layers of barricades and barricades
Yeah.
going on for like miles in every direction around the university.
Right.
And yeah, they basically barricaded themselves in there. And at PolyU, when I got there, they started rolling in armored vehicles and water cannons, which the water cannon is also an armored vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just like they basically just started trying to seize the university. They just had ranks of police officers behind the water cannons. The water cannons would come up to the university. They would just get hit with hundreds of Molotovs, and they would go back. I mean, hundreds of bricks and Molotovs, and then they would try to push forward, throwing, and the protesters they just held the line. Like, they were all there, like, just lines of protesters holding up their umbrellas.
Mm-hmm.
The protesters behind them throwing bricks and Molotovs at the armored vehicles and water tanks. And that was in the front end. Just,
Yeah.
I don't know, the amount of bravery that you have to just have nothing but an umbrella while you're being splashed with pepper spray water, which, like, a water cannon normally, it can knock you over and break bones and such. Like,
Yeah.
it's a nasty amount of force. But to top that off with it not being water but pepper spray,
Oh God.
on top of that having blue dye, making it that's very hard to get off your skin, so
Mm-hmm.
that they can arrest you later if they see any blue dye on you. It's really nasty. I don't know how the protesters can sit there and just take that much burning on their skin.
Yeah. It sounds like that sounds like the biggest, aside from just like abrasions and cuts and things like that, you're probably dealing with a lot of chemical burns that you have to treat. So I can only imagine.
Mostly tear gas is what I deal with, because they use as much tear gas as they can any chance they get.
Yeah. Gosh. So you're having to flush people's eyes, and now the tear
Yeah.
gas, was this a different type of tear gas than what we use here in the States, like what our cops use?
I mean, it's still CS gas, but like it is nastier overall.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know what happened, but after we left PolyU, it got to the point where there was dangerous levels of cyanide in the air.
Wow.
I mean, and I'm pretty sure that was from the tear gas.
Gosh. Oh God. That's kind of where you were, like, you left pretty soon after you escaped from PolyU, right?
Yeah, I went home. I
Okay.
went home the next day.
Okay. Was that just because it was the end of the time that you had set aside for that?
Yeah, I mean, I already bought the ticket home, so
Okay.
I wish I stayed a few days longer, because then I could have been there for the whole thing. But I mean, yeah, I just left the next day.
Yeah. Well, I guess that was pretty much most of the questions that I had about that. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, or anything you just wanted to say on their behalf?
I would say that they definitely need as much support as they can get, even silent, or I mean not silent, but just like making posts about it. As much support as they can get, the better, because I mean, the more that China sees that the world is on Hong Kong's side, the more likely that Hong Kong is going to get their demands met. And so people need, as much people as possible need to show their support for the Hong Kong protesters.
Thanks for talking to me, John. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
All right. That was my interview with John from Instagram, protester, medic in Hong Kong. If you want to follow us on Instagram, we're at Voluntary Vixens. We are on Twitter at Vixens Voluntary. We do a little bit of stuff on Facebook at Voluntary Vixens, but we're not quite as active on there as we are on Instagram. We also have a Patreon, which is Vixens_voluntary. So if you want to help us out, just let us know. And I'm going to try to put in the show notes pages some of the organizations that we can donate to help these Hong Kong protesters. Thank you so much for listening. And like Maddie always says, just keep it voluntary. Sorry, scratch that. Keep it sane, keep it peaceful, and keep it voluntary.